Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slow, slightly tragic, and very on brand for human history. So dim the lights, put your phone face down, maybe stare vaguely at the ceiling, and let your brain gently power down as we talk about a group of people who lived extremely well, right up until they didn't. Because tonight's story is about royal mistresses, specifically what happened to them after the king died, which, historically speaking, was almost never great. Being a royal mistress was one of those jobs that looked fantastic from a distance. You had jewels, you had rooms in the palace, you had servants whose entire job was helping you put on increasingly unnecessary layers of fabric. Sometimes you even had political influence, which always goes great and never causes resentment at all. But the job came with one very small problem. Your entire position depended on one man continuing to breathe. And when that stopped happening, things got awkward very fast. So let's ease into this, nice and calm, starting with the basic setup. In most European monarchies, kings were expected to marry for politics. Love was optional, preferably elsewhere. This created a long-standing system where wives handled legitimacy and heirs, while mistresses handled affection, companionship, and occasionally state policy, because of course they did. Some mistresses were kept discreet, others were extremely public. Many were effectively semi-official with titles, estates, and incomes. Everyone at court knew who they were. Ambassadors wrote about them, painters painted them, poets wrote deeply embarrassing poems about them. But here's the thing. None of that status was legally secure. A mistress had no real protection under law, no inheritance rights, no guaranteed pension, no promise that anyone would continue to care about her existence once the king stopped personally insisting that they do so. Which brings us to the moment that haunted every royal mistress, whether she admitted it or not. The king's bedteb. Sometimes it happens slowly, a lingering illness, a few weeks of whispered conversations, a gradual reduction in visitors. Other times it was sudden, a hunting accident, a stroke, a fever that went from mild inconvenience to fatal inconvenience in a matter of days. Either way, the result was the same. The king died, and the court immediately reorganized itself without you. Let's start gently with France, because France really leaned into the whole official mistress concept. They even had a title for it, Maîtresse en titre. Very classy, very formal, very doomed. One of the most famous examples is Madame de Pompadour, the longtime mistress of King Louis XV. Now, Pompadour was actually luckier than most, because she died before the king did, which sounds bad, but in this context, it's sort of a win. Pompadour had enormous influence. She advised the king. She shaped art and fashion. She patronized philosophers. She was deeply involved in court politics. People hated her for it, especially the nobility, especially the queen, especially anyone who resented the fact that a woman not born into ancient nobility was effectively running the vibe of France. If Pompadour had outlived Louis XV, things would have gotten uncomfortable, because when kings died, the new regime tended to do a little spring cleaning. Which brings us to the more typical outcome, exile. Exile was popular. It was clean. It was quiet. It didn't require public executions or awkward explanations. A mistress would simply be informed that her presence was no longer required, her apartments reassigned, her servants dismissed, her allowance reevaluated. She might be sent to a country estate, or a convent, or a distant relative's house where she could quietly stop mattering. Sometimes she'd be given a small pension, enough to survive, not enough to be powerful, just enough to ensure she didn't make too much noise about how things used to be. And sometimes, not even that. Let's float over to England for a moment, where royal mistresses were technically unofficial but extremely obvious. English kings tended to be married, Protestant, and deeply allergic to the idea of openly acknowledging mistresses, while also absolutely having them. Take Barbara Palmer, mistress to King Charles II.
Charles had many mistresses, because of course he did, but Barbara was the most prominent for a time. She was fiery. She was ambitious. She was famously unbothered by public opinion. She had children with the king, who he openly acknowledged and showered with titles. While Charles lived, Barbara was untouchable. When Charles died, the situation changed overnight. The new king, James II, was not interested in continuing his brother's arrangements. Barbara lost influence immediately. Her income shrank. Her access vanished. The court politely stopped returning her calls, which at the time involved messengers physically not showing up anymore. She survived, technically, but the life of privilege was over, and she was one of the lucky ones. Because sometimes the queen got involved. Queens, understandably, were often not fans of their husbands' mistresses, but while the king lived, queens had to tolerate them. They smiled politely, they hosted dinners, they endured the humiliation. They waited, and when the king died, it was finally their turn. There are numerous cases of queens immediately banishing mistresses from court, confiscating gifts, reclaiming jewels, ordering portraits destroyed, making it very clear that the era of tolerance was over. In some cases, queens forced mistresses into convents, not necessarily because they were particularly religious, but because convents were useful places to put inconvenient women where they could no longer cause problems. A convent was safe. It was controlled. It removed the woman from public life entirely. And once inside, leaving was complicated. Let's drift over to Spain, where things got especially bleak. Spanish court culture was rigid, Catholic, and deeply invested in appearances. Mistresses existed, but they were treated with a mix of secrecy and moral panic. When Spanish kings died, mistresses often vanished from the historical record almost immediately, which is historian code for something unpleasant happened and nobody wanted to write it down. Some were married off quickly to minor nobles. Some were sent to religious institutions. Some were quietly stripped of property and left dependent on relatives who suddenly resented them deeply. And then there were the women who had gone all in on the relationship. Women who had alienated their families, made enemies at court, built their entire identity around being the king's favorite. When the king died, they didn't just lose a lover. They lost their job, their home, their protection, and their social standing. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that everyone who used to bow to you now pretends you don't exist, that guards no longer let you through doors you once walked freely, that the palace you lived in now treats you like an awkward roomer. And you can't complain, because officially, you were never supposed to be there in the first place. Let's gently slide back to France again, because they produced an impressive number of cautionary tales. Consider Madame du Barry, the last mistress of Louis XV. Now, du Barry was actually luckier than most, because she died before the king did, which sounds bad, but in this context, it's sort of a win. Du Barry had enormous influence. She advised the king. She shaped art and fashion. She patronized philosophers. She was deeply involved in court politics. People hated her for it, especially the nobility, especially the queen, especially anyone who resented the fact that a woman not born into ancient nobility was effectively running the vibe of France. If Pompadour had outlived Louis XV, things would have gotten uncomfortable, because when kings died, the new regime tended to do a little spring cleaning. Which brings us to the more typical outcome: exile. Exile was popular. It was clean. It was quiet. It didn't require public executions or awkward explanations. A mistress would simply be informed that her presence was no longer required, her apartments reassigned, her servants dismissed, her allowance reevaluated. She might be sent to a country estate, or a convent, or a distant relative's house where she could quietly stop mattering. Sometimes she'd be given a small pension, enough to survive, not enough to be powerful, just enough to ensure she didn't make too much noise about how things used to be. And sometimes, not even that. Let's float over to England for a moment, where royal mistresses were technically unofficial but extremely obvious. English kings tended to be married, Protestant, and deeply allergic to the idea of openly acknowledging mistresses, while also absolutely having them. Take Barbara Palmer, mistress to King Charles II. Charles had many mistresses, because of course he did, but Barbara was the most prominent for a time. She was fiery. She was ambitious. She was famously unbothered by public opinion. She had children with the king, who he openly acknowledged and showered with titles. While Charles lived, Barbara was untouchable. When Charles died, the situation changed overnight. The new king, James II, was not interested in continuing his brother's arrangements. Barbara lost influence immediately. Her income shrank. Her access vanished. The court politely stopped returning her calls, which at the time involved messengers physically not showing up anymore. She survived, technically.
All right, let's gently drift back in. Same low lights, same slow breathing, same historical discomfort. When we left off, our royal mistresses had just discovered the central flaw in their career choice. The king died, the court moved on, and suddenly their lifetime of luxury turned into a very quiet problem no one wanted to solve. Now, at this point, some of them still had hope, because they had children. And surely, that had to count for something. Historically speaking, it counted a little, but never as much as they wanted. Royal mistresses who bore children to kings occupied a strange middle ground. Their children were often acknowledged, sometimes even loved, but almost never legitimate, which meant they existed in a legal gray fog where everything depended on the mood of whoever was currently wearing the crown. While the king lived, these children were dressed well, educated carefully, given titles that sounded impressive but didn't come with actual authority. They were useful, they were symbols, they were living proof of the king's virility, which for some reason was always considered excellent political news. But once the king died, those children became inconvenient, because royal courts do not enjoy loose ends. Let's float back to England again, because English monarchs were especially good at this particular emotional contradiction. King Charles II, for example, acknowledged more illegitimate children than most people acknowledge houseplants. He gave them dukedoms, he married them well, he set them up nicely while he was alive. After his death, the support network thinned out fast. Some children retained their titles, but their political relevance evaporated. Others found their incomes reduced. And some were quietly pushed to the side so the legitimate line could proceed without awkward reminders of how busy their father had been. For the mistresses themselves, motherhood was not the shield they hoped it would be. Many assumed that having borne the king's child guaranteed lifelong security, a pension, protection, a place at court, at the very least continued relevance. This assumption was optimistic. New kings were often related to the old king in ways that made the mistress uncomfortable. Sometimes she was their uncle's former lover, sometimes their father's embarrassing habit, sometimes the woman who reminded everyone of a morally inconvenient chapter. And new queens? New queens were rarely sentimental. Queens had their own children to protect, their own dynasties to secure, their own legacy to clean up. And the presence of former mistresses with royal children wandering around the palace was not ideal for that goal. So, policies changed. Pensions were reduced, access was restricted, invitations stopped arriving. The children might be taken into royal custody for education, which was sometimes genuine and sometimes a polite way of separating them from their mother permanently. And the mother? She was expected to be grateful for whatever scraps remained. In France, this system became almost ritualized. Mistresses with children were often removed from court entirely, but allowed to live quietly on estates where they could raise their children under supervision.
The children might later be absorbed into noble families or sent into military or religious careers. This wasn't kindness, it was containment. A way of ensuring that the next generation of royal power didn't have to trip over reminders of the previous king's emotional life. Let's slow things down even further and talk about promises, because kings were excellent at making them. Promises of lifelong support, promises of protection, promises that you will always be taken care of. Promises whispered in velvet rooms, under candlelight, during moments when everything felt permanent. And to be fair, some kings meant it. They set up trusts, granted lands, created legal arrangements to support former mistresses after their deaths. Occasionally, they even left instructions in their wills. But here's the problem. Wills are only as strong as the people who choose to honor them. And royal wills were famously flexible. Successors could reinterpret them, delay them, quietly ignore them, or claim that circumstances had changed, which they always had, because history never sits still and waits for anyone's emotional needs to be resolved. So, a woman might genuinely believe she was secure. She might have paperwork, titles, seals, witnesses. And then the king died, and suddenly none of it mattered as much as she thought. This is where we start seeing the emotional toll set in. Former mistresses writing letters, making appeals, asking for audiences that never came, trying to remind the court who they once were. And the court, politely, moved on. There's a certain exhaustion that settles over these stories. Not explosive tragedy, not dramatic downfall, just a slow dimming. A woman who once influenced policy now negotiating for basic income. A former favorite watching younger courtiers pretend they don't recognize her. A mother realizing her children's future is no longer hers to shape. And then there were the mistresses who had leaned a little too far into politics. These women were the most dangerous, and therefore the most disposable. If a mistress had advised the king on appointments, alliances, or religious policy, she accumulated enemies, real ones, people who had waited patiently for their chance to settle scores. When the king died, those enemies finally had permission. Exile became immediate, sometimes harsh, occasionally permanent. In extreme cases, accusations followed: financial impropriety, moral corruption, treasonous influence, charges that were vague enough to be useful and specific enough to justify removal. And because these women had no official standing, defending themselves was nearly impossible. Their power was never formal, so their downfall didn't need to be either. Let's drift south for a moment, to Italy, where royal and princely courts operated with even more casual cruelty. Mistresses to dukes and princes often enjoyed spectacular lifestyles, art commissions, private palaces, cultural influence. But Italian politics were volatile. When rulers fell or died unexpectedly, mistresses could find themselves caught between factions. Some were arrested, some were forced into marriages meant to neutralize them. Some vanished into convents so completely that historians can only guess at their later lives. There is a particular sadness to reading court records where a woman appears frequently for years and then stops. No death notice, no exile decree, no dramatic ending. Just silence, which historically is never a great sign. Now, not every story ended badly. A small number of mistresses managed to outlive kings and remain respected figures, usually because they were discreet, politically neutral, and very good at knowing when to step back. They retired early, they avoided public conflict, they made peace with queens, they invested their wealth wisely, they didn't push their luck. These women survived because they understood something crucial. The relationship was temporary, the power was borrowed, and the exit had to be graceful. But most didn't have that luxury. because when you're inside a palace, surrounded by ritual and reinforcement, it's very easy to believe the fantasy, to think that affection equals permanence, that proximity equals protection. History tells us otherwise. Royal mistresses lived lives suspended between privilege and precarity. They experienced extraordinary intimacy with power without ever being allowed to touch it legally. They shaped history from the margins, then were pushed back into obscurity when convenient. And the cruelest part, many of them were blamed for their own downfall, accused of ambition, of manipulation, of moral failure, as if they had personally invented the system that used them and discarded them. As we drift forward, things will get a little colder. We'll see what happened when mistresses outlived not just kings, but entire political eras, when revolutions arrived, when public opinion turned, when being associated with monarchy itself became dangerous. For now, just let this part settle. The children, the promises, the illusions of safety, all floating quietly away as history does what it does best. It keeps moving, and it rarely looks back.
All right, let's ease back in again. Same slow pace, same gentle drifting, same realization that history is rarely kind to people who exist just outside the rules. By the time we reach this part of the story, our former royal mistresses are no longer clinging to hope. The king is gone, the promises have thinned out, the children have been redistributed, and what remains is a quieter, colder force, the court itself, because courts had memories, long ones, petty ones, and once the central figure holding everything together was gone, those memories had room to stretch out and get comfortable. This is usually the point where queens step fully into the picture. Now, it's important to say this gently, because history sometimes frames queens as villains in these stories, and that's not quite fair. Queens were operating inside the same rigid system as everyone else. They had spent years, sometimes decades, enduring public humiliation in silence, smiling at banquets, standing beside husbands who openly preferred someone else, raising legitimate heirs while watching affection go elsewhere. Queens learned patience, and patience, when finally released, can look very decisive. Once the king died, queens often became the emotional center of the court. Their authority increased, their opinions mattered, and their tolerance for reminders of their husband's romantic detours dropped to zero. This is when former mistresses discovered that survival now depended less on past intimacy and more on present usefulness. Many queens moved quickly. Orders were issued, residences reassigned, invitations rescinded, jewelry reclaimed for the crown. It was all very polite, very administrative, very final. A mistress might be informed that her apartments were needed for someone else, or that the court was restructuring, or that her presence was no longer appropriate for the new tone of the reign. No shouting, no drama, just doors quietly closing. In some cases, queens insisted on religious repentance, not always out of deep personal piety, but because repentance was a socially acceptable way to remove a woman from public life. Enter the convent. Convents were incredibly useful institutions. They provided food, shelter, and moral justification. A former mistress could be presented as choosing a life of reflection, when in reality she had been given very few alternatives. Once inside, she was safe, she was quiet, and most importantly, she was no longer visible. And visibility was the real threat. Courts thrived on appearance, on ritual, on the illusion of stability. Former mistresses disrupted that illusion simply by existing. They reminded everyone that power had once flowed differently, that intimacy had shaped decisions, that the crown was worn by a human being with habits and weaknesses. New regimes preferred cleaner narratives, so the women who complicated those narratives were edited out. Let's drift back to France again, because French courts were especially theatrical about transitions.
When a king died, everything changed at once. Mourning clothes, new etiquette, new favorites, new alliances. Former mistresses were expected to understand the message without needing it spelled out. Some complied immediately. They left court quietly, retreated to estates, kept their heads down. Others resisted. They tried to maintain access. They wrote letters. They appealed to old allies. These women usually lost, because court loyalty is a very temporary condition. People who had once praised them now avoided them. People who had once benefited from their favor now claimed distance. People who had once owed them everything suddenly remembered other obligations. It wasn't personal, it was practical. And this is where the emotional temperature of these stories drops even further. There are no dramatic confrontations here, no shouting matches in throne rooms, just a slow, collective decision to stop acknowledging someone's relevance. Imagine attending a gathering where conversations gently move away from you, where eye contact fades, where your name is no longer mentioned in planning discussions. That was court exile, and it could be more painful than physical exile because it happened in the same rooms where power once flowed toward you. Now let's talk briefly about what happened when mistresses had made enemies beyond the queen. Some had angered powerful ministers. Some had influenced appointments. Some had accepted bribes. Some had simply existed too confidently. These women were in real danger once the king died, because accusations are much easier to make when someone no longer has protection. Accusations didn't need to be proven, they just needed to be useful. Financial misconduct, moral corruption, political interference, undermining the crown, undermining religion in general. These accusations were often vague, contradictory, and conveniently timed. And because mistresses held no official office, defending themselves was almost impossible. They had no formal role to point to, no legal authority to appeal from, no institutional support. Their power had always been personal. So when the personal connection ended, there was nothing left to stand on. Some women were placed under house arrest. Some were stripped of property. Some were forced into marriages designed to neutralize them. Some disappeared into convents under conditions that historians still argue about. And then there are the cases where records simply stop. No death date, no exile decree, no retirement notice, just silence, which usually means that whatever happened was not something the court wanted remembered. Let's slow this down a bit, because this is where modern listeners often feel a strange disconnect. It's tempting to ask why these women didn't just leave earlier, why they didn't secure their independence, why they trusted a system so clearly stacked against them. But from inside the system, things looked different. Royal courts were convincing environments. They rewarded loyalty, they reinforced hierarchy, they normalized inequality, and they offered immediate, tangible benefits for compliance. When a king told you you were safe, it felt true, because for years it had been. When courtiers treated you with respect, it felt permanent, because it had been consistent. When wealth and influence flowed easily, it was easy to believe they always would. History, unfortunately, is very good at reminding people that stability is often temporary. Now let's talk about age. Youth mattered at court, beauty mattered, novelty mattered. Former mistresses who aged visibly after a king's death found themselves doubly marginalized. Not only were they politically irrelevant, but they no longer fit the court's aesthetic expectations. Some leaned into dignity, others into religion, some into bitterness, some into quiet acceptance. But very few were allowed to remain public figures. Their stories transitioned from gossip to footnotes, from headlines to whispers. And then something else happened. Time. As years passed, new scandals replaced old ones. New mistresses appeared under new kings. New controversies captured attention. Former favorites became historical background noise, which is perhaps the strangest part of all. These women had once influenced decisions affecting entire nations, wars, alliances, cultural movements, and within a decade, their names could be forgotten entirely. not because they weren't important, but because history prefers simplicity. Queens were legitimate, kings were central, mistresses complicated the narrative. So history trimmed. As we float forward, we're approaching the most dangerous phase of all, the moment when monarchy itself becomes unstable, when revolutions begin murmuring, when being associated with the old regime stops being socially awkward and starts being physically risky. For mistresses who survived long enough to see that shift, the consequences were no longer just emotional or financial. They became existential. But for now, let this part settle softly. The queens reclaiming space, the courts rearranging loyalty, the slow erasure of once powerful women. History exhaling and moving on. And we, very calmly, will move with it.
All right, dim the lights, settle in, and let your mind float softly. By now, these former royal mistresses exist entirely in quieter worlds. Palaces and courtiers have long vanished. Children are grown. Kings and queens have passed, and the attention that once defined their lives has completely faded. Time moves slowly here, measured by sunlight across gardens, the rhythm of seasons, the flicker of candlelight, and the soft echo of memory. Daily life is deliberate and intentional. Walking in gardens, tending plants, pruning paths, observing birds and shadows, and caring for household spaces, all these acts occupy their days. Though unnoticed by most of history, these small acts carry subtle influence, shaping children and grandchildren, guiding household staff, or quietly supporting neighbors and local artists. Influence no longer demands spectacle. It exists in quiet, persistent, and thoughtful action. Letters remain companions. Some are sent to distant relatives or old friends, carrying advice, care, and observation. Many remain private, tucked away, never intended to be read. In these letters, they reflect on decades of human experience, navigating favor and exile, managing children's futures, observing the fleeting nature of public attention, and quietly shaping small corners of the world. Memory is gentle yet persistent. They recall moments of influence, love, rivalry, betrayal, and fleeting fame. Past events that once demanded attention now exist as reflections, softened by distance and time. There is satisfaction in survival and calm pride in enduring through decades of uncertainty, scrutiny, and ephemeral fortune. Gardens become both work and meditation, observing growth and decay, light and shadow, and the slow rhythm of the seasons mirrors human life, impermanence, patience, beauty, and care. Each careful gesture, pruning a flower, walking a familiar path, leaves subtle marks that ripple forward, a quiet testament to patience and persistence. Reading and writing sustain them. Books, letters, and private reflections preserve insight, wisdom, and quiet understanding. Deliberate contemplation allows them to see the patterns of human behavior, the impermanence of power, and the lasting significance of subtle, patient influence. Quiet endurance becomes its own form of legacy, far more enduring than public attention ever could be. Social interactions are soft and selective. Old friends visit rarely but meaningfully. Children may be distant, grandchildren occasionally present. Rivals fade entirely from consciousness. Influence is exercised subtly, gently, without spectacle, shaping relationships through care, observation, and quiet guidance. Finally, there is profound calm in fading. Public attention is gone. Courtly pressures disappeared. Life continues quietly, deliberately, reflectively. Survival itself, measured in patient endurance and thoughtful care, becomes a remarkable achievement. Imagine, for the final drift of Part 26, these women walking slowly through gardens at dusk, reading letters by candlelight,
observing shadows and light, reflecting on decades of experience, and quietly tending the small world they still inhabit. Their presence is gentle, influence subtle, and legacy quietly persistent. Even as history forgets names, palaces crumble, and public attention fades, the quiet endurance, subtle reflection, and invisible influence of these lives persist. They remind us that life's significance does not always demand spectacle, that influence does not always need recognition, and that patience, calm observation, and deliberate care are forms of power in themselves. Sleep now. Let the soft echoes of these lives carry you gently into calm, reflective rest, unhurried, gentle, and quietly enduring. All right, dim the lights, settle in, and let your mind drift gently. By this point, these women have lived long, full, and quiet lives. The corridors of palaces, the whispers of courtiers, and the attention of kings and queens are long gone. The world of spectacle and favor has faded, leaving behind slow, deliberate rhythms of daily life, quiet reflection, and gentle observation. Life is structured by subtle routines, walking in gardens, tending plants, observing the soft movement of seasons, feeding animals, overseeing small estates, reading letters, and writing reflections. Each task carries weight, even if invisible to history. Small acts ripple quietly, advice to grandchildren, guidance for household staff, or support for neighbors or local artists. Influence no longer requires display. It exists in patient, deliberate, unseen ways. Letters continue to be companions. Some are sent, carrying care, advice, or guidance. Most remain private, tucked away, meant only for reflection. In writing, they process decades of experience, surviving courts, navigating rivalries, losing favor, adapting to obscurity, and quietly shaping lives without recognition. These reflections are gentle, meditative, and sometimes tinged with nostalgia or melancholy, revealing the wisdom of a life once entwined with power. Memory becomes both companion and teacher. They recall moments of love, rivalry, betrayal, fleeting fame, and influence. Past intrigues are softened by time. The ephemeral nature of beauty, power, and attention is clear, and yet satisfaction emerges in endurance, adaptability, and subtle persistence. They have learned to navigate life without applause, to exert influence without recognition, and to find meaning in quiet, deliberate acts. Gardens provide both work and meditation. Observing growth and decay, light and shadow, and the rhythms of seasons mirrors human life, impermanence, patience, beauty, and care. Each deliberate gesture, pruning, planting, walking familiar paths, leaves invisible traces of presence and persistence. These subtle acts become lasting marks, quietly shaping the world around them. Reading and reflection anchor their days. Books, letters, and private reflections preserve insight, understanding, and quiet wisdom. Deliberate contemplation allows them to see the patterns of human behavior, the impermanence of power, and the lasting significance of subtle, patient influence. Quiet endurance becomes its own form of legacy, far more enduring than public attention ever could be. Social interactions are soft and selective. Old friends visit rarely but meaningfully. Children may be distant, grandchildren occasionally present. Rivals fade entirely from consciousness. Influence is exercised subtly, gently, without spectacle, shaping relationships through care, observation, and quiet guidance. Finally, there is profound calm in fading. Public attention is gone. Courtly pressures disappeared. Life continues quietly, deliberately, reflectively. Survival itself, measured in patient endurance and thoughtful care, becomes a remarkable achievement. Imagine, for the final drift of Part 26, These women walking slowly through gardens at dusk, reading letters by candlelight, observing shadows and light, reflecting on decades of experience, and quietly tending the small world they still inhabit. Their presence is gentle, influence subtle, and legacy quietly persistent. Even as history forgets names, palaces crumble, and public attention fades, the quiet endurance, subtle reflection, and invisible influence of these lives persist. They remind us that life's significance does not always demand spectacle, that influence does not always need recognition, and that patience, calm observation, and deliberate care are forms of power in themselves. Sleep now. Let the soft echoes of these lives carry you gently into calm, reflective rest, unhurried, gentle, and quietly enduring.
All right, dim the lights, settle in, and let your mind float softly. By now, these former royal mistresses exist entirely in quieter worlds. Palaces and courtiers have long vanished. Children are grown. Kings and queens have passed, and the attention that once defined their lives has completely faded. Time moves slowly here, measured by sunlight across gardens, the rhythm of seasons, the flicker of candlelight, and the soft echo of memory. Daily life is deliberate and intentional. Walking in gardens, tending plants, pruning paths, observing birds and shadows, and caring for household spaces, all these acts occupy their days. Though unnoticed by most of history, these small acts carry subtle influence. All right, welcome back one last time. Same slow rhythm, same dim mental lighting, same sense that we're reaching the place where stories stop trying to impress anyone. By the time we arrive at this final phase, there are no courts left to navigate, no queens to appease, no revolutions actively hunting symbols. What remains is something far less dramatic and far more common: time. Most royal mistresses did not meet spectacular ends. They didn't die on stages. They weren't remembered in final speeches. They didn't receive last-minute vindication or poetic justice. They simply lived on, and then stopped. For many former mistresses, the final decades of life were quiet to the point of invisibility. They lived in modest houses or country estates, sometimes alone, sometimes with distant relatives who tolerated them, sometimes surrounded by servants who remembered better days but no longer spoke of them. Their days became small, walking in gardens, attending church, managing reduced finances, reading letters that grew fewer every year. This is the part of the story historians rarely linger on because it lacks spectacle. There are no turning points, no dramatic reversals, just the slow normalization of obscurity, which, for women who once shaped royal moods and national decisions, was a profound adjustment. Some adapted well. They found comfort in routine, in faith, in charity, in the simple relief of no longer being watched, no longer being evaluated, no longer needing to perform importance. Others struggled. There are letters, rare ones, where former mistresses speak of loneliness, of being forgotten, of realizing that the relationships they thought were real had always been conditional, friendly as long as they were useful, silent afterward. A few tried to reclaim their stories. They wrote memoirs or dictated accounts to sympathetic listeners. These writings were often defensive, explanatory, and deeply human. They wanted to be understood. They wanted history to know that they were not just stereotypes, not temptresses, not villains, not caricatures of excess. They were people navigating a system with very few good options.
Most of these accounts were ignored, or lost, or dismissed as self-serving, because history tends to prefer clean narratives over complicated truths, and royal mistresses complicated everything. There's something deeply ironic about how their stories end. These women were once considered morally dangerous, socially disruptive, politically influential, and yet their final years were often defined by irrelevance, not punished, not redeemed, just forgotten. And forgetting, it turns out, is one of history's favorite tools. Their names vanished from official records, their portraits were stored away, their contributions were quietly absorbed into the achievements of the men they'd once supported. When they appeared at all, it was as footnotes, as gossip, as cautionary examples, rarely as full human lives. Some former mistresses outlived everyone who had known them at court. Kings died, queens died, rivals died, children moved on, and eventually there was no one left who remembered who they had been. At that point, even resentment faded, which sounds peaceful, and in some ways it was. There is a strange calm in anonymity, a freedom in no longer being watched, in no longer being measured against impossible standards, in no longer having to justify one's existence. For a few women, this anonymity was a relief. They finally belonged to themselves. For others, it felt like erasure, because to be forgotten entirely is to wonder whether any of it mattered. The love, the sacrifices, the compromises, the risks. History does not answer those questions. It simply moves on. And so when we look back at royal mistresses as a group, what we see is not a single story, but a pattern. Lives lived close to power, shaped by affection, ambition, and constraint. Lives that burned brightly for a moment, then dimmed quietly. They remind us that proximity to power is not the same as possessing it, that influence without protection is fragile, and that systems built on hierarchy rarely care about the individuals they use. Kings were remembered, queens were remembered, dynasties were remembered. The women who existed between those categories, not so much. And yet, here we are, talking about them, remembering them softly, without judgment, letting their stories unfold at a human pace, which feels appropriate, because these were not loud lives in the end. They ended the way many lives do, with fewer visitors, shorter letters, longer silences, and then, eventually, nothing at all. So as we let this story fade out, let your thoughts slow with it. No need to hold on to details, no need to reach conclusions. Just let the history drift past, like a half-remembered dream. Thank you for listening. Get some rest, and as always, history will still be here when you wake up.
All right, one final gentle drift before we close the story completely. Dim the lights. Let your mind float. No rush, no drama, just soft reflection. By now, we've wandered through the lives of women who lived at the edges of power, women who enjoyed luxuries, influence, and attention, but only as long as a king's heart kept beating. Women who learned, slowly and often painfully, that favor is temporary and history is selective. In this last part, let's consider what all of that really means without needing to dramatize it, because the lesson isn't a sudden shock, it's subtle. First, let's talk about fragility. Royal mistresses lived on borrowed security. Everything they had, clothes, jewels, apartments, even affection, depended on someone else's choices. Their influence was never formalized, their position never guaranteed. It could vanish quietly, without fanfare, and often did. This teaches us something soft but important. Proximity to power is never the same as control. No matter how much beauty, cunning, or charm a woman possessed, her life could shift overnight, and she had little recourse. Next, let's touch on privilege. Despite the precarity, these women had access to resources that ordinary people could only dream of. Lavish gowns, fine art, estates, education for children, influence over court decisions. They were, in many ways, living in worlds of extraordinary comfort. And yet, that comfort came at a cost: total dependence. Everything they were granted could be withdrawn in a moment. Luxury in this context was a tether, a reminder of how fleeting human fortune can be. There is also a lesson about memory and legacy. Many former mistresses spent their final decades quietly, erased from public records. Some tried to reclaim their stories. Most were forgotten. Yet here we are remembering them, softly, centuries later. The irony is subtle but profound. Being forgotten in life does not mean being forgotten forever. History whispers when it could have roared. Finally, there's a human lesson in patience and acceptance. Some women learn to survive by stepping aside, by embracing quiet routines, by investing in relationships outside court influence. They found peace not in power, but in calm resilience. And in a way, that resilience is a kind of triumph. Not loud, not celebrated, but deeply human. So, as we let this story settle, consider the strange mixture of fortune and fragility these lives demonstrate. Power can be intoxicating, but only temporarily. Influence can be significant, but fleeting. Attention can feel permanent, but fades quickly. And yet, even lives erased from official records leave traces, soft traces, that remind us of human ambition, love, and vulnerability. Let's take one last deep breath. Imagine the soft halls of the palaces we've wandered. Picture the women quietly moving through empty corridors, walking along fading gardens, tending to children, reading letters by candlelight, and finally, slowly letting go. History is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is gentle. Sometimes it is a whisper. Sometimes it is a lullaby for the restless mind. And in that quiet, we find a strange comfort. Sleep well, and let the echoes of forgotten lives drift softly through your thoughts.
All right, let's drift one more time, slower now, like the very last candle burning in a long hall. No sudden movements, no drama, just soft reflection on what it all means. By this stage, we can step back and see the bigger picture, not just individual mistresses, but the patterns they reveal about human life, power, and history. Royal mistresses were, in essence, temporary fixtures in a world built on hierarchy and inheritance. Their lives teach us that proximity to authority is fragile, influence is conditional, wealth is never guaranteed. Even love in these contexts is often transactional. Yet within that fragility, there is something strangely enduring. The choices these women made, the risks they took, the children they bore, and the alliances they formed, these were all attempts to carve permanence out of impermanence. And in that, there is a quiet courage. Let's consider memory. Historians often overlook mistresses or reduce them to clichés, the temptress, the scandal, the luxurious excess. But when we slow down, we see human beings negotiating survival, affection, and ambition under extremely limited circumstances. History forgets them because it prefers neat narratives, but their stories persist in letters, portraits, estates, and subtle social changes they influenced. We can also reflect on time. For these women, life operated on unusual rhythms. The years of favor passed quickly, the years of exile dragged slowly. Aging brought invisibility faster than it brought peace. Yet in those final decades, they often developed resilience, reflection, and even wisdom. They outlived their own drama. They outlived kings, courts, revolutions, and rumors. And in doing so, they achieved a kind of quiet mastery over life that power alone could never grant. And finally, a lesson for anyone listening tonight: the difference between influence and legacy. Influence can be immediate, tangible, and dazzling, but fleeting. Legacy is slower, quieter, and subtle. It is traced in memory, in culture, in small acts that ripple forward. Former royal mistresses may have lost their official power, their wealth, even public recognition, but their existence shaped the people, politics, and culture around them. Their legacies are soft, almost invisible, but real. So as we let this story flow gently toward its conclusion, imagine these women in their final years, walking quietly in gardens, reading letters by fading light, teaching children who may or may not remember them, tending small routines that no one else recorded. They were ordinary and extraordinary at once, privileged yet precarious, powerful yet dependent, remembered by few, but echoing through history anyway. History moves quickly, but these stories ask us to pause, to recognize subtlety, to see the quiet patterns in human lives that textbooks rarely emphasize. So let your thoughts slow. Let the images drift past. Let the soft melancholy of these lives settle gently. And in that settling, find a quiet reflection on power, vulnerability, and human resilience. Sleep now. Let the corridors of forgotten palaces and the whispers of history carry you slowly into rest.
All right, let's drift further now, even softer. We're leaving the palaces and the immediate courts behind. This is about what happens when the influence of royal mistresses stretches beyond the gilded walls, when their stories ripple quietly into wider society. By now, most mistresses we've followed are long removed from power. Kings are dead, queens have stabilized their courts, children are raised, married, or placed elsewhere. And yet, these women's lives continue to touch history in subtle ways. Some became patrons of the arts. Those jewels and estates, once symbols of fleeting favor, were transformed into libraries, salons, or charitable projects. Paintings were commissioned, music was funded, architecture was supported. These contributions often outlived their creators, even if their names did not. And in a quiet sense, influence persisted, not through force, but through culture. Others shaped social norms. Former mistresses who moved into convents or quiet estates often mentored younger women, taught children, or managed households. Their knowledge of etiquette, court politics, and strategy was passed down, even if unofficially. In these gentle ways, they left marks that history might not formally record, but which quietly affected generations. It's also worth noting the emotional legacy. Mistresses who survived public disgrace or fading power often developed extraordinary emotional intelligence. They learned negotiation, patience, and subtlety. They learned how to navigate shifting alliances and social turbulence. These skills, while invisible to public records, were highly influential for the people around them. There is an irony here. The very women once dismissed as superficial or morally corrupt often became pillars of private influence once the public stage was closed to them.
They had lived at the center of intense scrutiny, and that experience allowed them to maneuver subtly in quieter contexts, shaping lives without notice. But not all stories are gentle. Some mistresses, particularly in volatile regions or eras, faced danger simply for being associated with former monarchs. Revolutions, coups, and regime changes did not care about nuance. The same women who survived palace exile sometimes faced imprisonment, confiscation of property, or forced flight. And still, they carried themselves through life with as much dignity and calm as possible, quietly adapting to circumstances they could not control. By this point, most had learned a profound truth. History is both cruel and indifferent, but survival is quiet and deliberate. Power can disappear overnight, recognition can vanish, influence can be erased, and yet life continues, routine continues, small acts of humanity continue, and those who survive quietly continue to shape the world even when unacknowledged. Finally, there is a kind of poetic closure in imagining these women in their last years, walking through gardens they once ordered or designed, reading by soft candlelight, observing children who are the grandchildren of kings or distant relatives, quietly pleased or melancholy at small successes, sipping tea in estates no longer grand, yet still private and peaceful. Their lives had been dramatic once, but now they fade slowly into calm, leaving traces that can only be discerned if one looks closely. And that is the subtle power of history. Not in the loud battles, not in the dynastic marriages, not in proclamations or wars, but in the quiet endurance of those who existed on the margins of power. The women who survived, adapted, and even in obscurity, influenced the world in ways unseen. So as we let this chapter settle, imagine these soft echoes drifting across centuries. Royal mistresses, once the center of intrigue, now ghosts in libraries, gardens, and letters, teaching us about fragility, resilience, and the invisible flow of influence. Close your eyes, let their quiet world float by, and let history, for just a moment, lull you gently into rest.
All right, let's drift into the last soft stretch. No rush, no drama, just the final echoes of these lives, the gentle fading of stories that once shimmered in palaces, salons, and gardens. By now, most royal mistresses we've been following are long gone from the public stage. Their influence, their jewels, their titles, they've all been returned, reassigned, or quietly erased. What remains is memory, fragile and fleeting. And for many of them, that memory exists only in whispers, in letters tucked away, in paintings gathering dust, in estates slowly falling into quiet decay. It's worth pausing to think about the emotional landscape of this fading. For women who spent decades navigating favor, affection, and politics, the quiet at the end could feel like both relief and loss. Relief from scrutiny, from the constant need to perform influence. Loss for everything that could not last, for every promise that proved conditional, for every child or ally taken away by the inevitability of time and circumstance. There is a peculiar dignity in these final years. Some women embraced solitude. They walked gardens slowly, observing nature, listening to birds, or tending small plants. They read and wrote, leaving personal reflections, poetry, or quiet observations for themselves rather than posterity. The world had moved on, but in their private spaces, they were still fully alive. Others found ways to quietly shape their environment, supporting neighbors, mentoring younger women, offering wisdom or guidance. Influence in these moments was subtle and local, far from the pomp of courts and public recognition, and yet it was meaningful. The lives of ordinary people could be enriched, and small, enduring ripples were created that history rarely notes.
Some found solace in faith or contemplative practice. Convents, chapels, or small estates became sanctuaries. These were spaces where they could exist without judgment or expectation, where past grandeur mattered little, and the rhythm of daily life, candlelight, meals, gardens, letters, was enough to hold their attention. And for the few whose names survived in public memory, the legacy was often distorted. They were remembered as scandal, intrigue, or moral lesson. Rarely were they remembered as full human beings, navigating extremely difficult circumstances with whatever agency they could muster. Their real stories, the quiet complexities, often existed only in surviving letters, estate records, or fleeting mentions by historians. By this stage, age had softened their presence. Youth, beauty, or novelty was no longer the measure of value. What remained was character, endurance, and memory. And yet, even memory is fragile. As families dispersed, estates changed hands, and political landscapes shifted, the traces of these women's lives diminished further. History is selective. It prefers kings, queens, and wars. Mistresses, for all their influence, were often footnotes. Yet their lives offer lessons about resilience, the fragility of power, and the quiet strength required to navigate a world built around others' authority. As we close this chapter, imagine them one last time, quietly walking halls that no longer belong to them, tending gardens that once celebrated their presence, reading letters whose authors are long gone, sipping tea in solitude, watching the world carry on. Their stories fade, but their lived experience, complex, fragile, and quietly persistent, remains a subtle echo in history's vast archive. And so we let these lives rest, not with drama, not with spectacle, but softly, gently, like a candle finally burning down to wax. Sleep now, and let these echoes of the past drift with you, soft and unhurried, into calm reflection. Let's drift slowly, calmly, and let everything settle. No rush, no urgency, just soft, reflective closure. By now, we've followed royal mistresses through court favor, influence, exile, fading power, and quiet disappearance. We've seen them survive monarchs, queens, revolutions, and public opinion. We've seen their influence slip away, their names erased from official records, and yet their subtle legacies persist in ways history rarely acknowledges. The final lesson here is about impermanence and resilience. Life at the edges of power is fragile. Privilege can vanish. Affection can fade. Wealth can be withdrawn. And yet, life continues. Even in obscurity, human beings adapt, survive, and leave traces that ripple forward in unseen ways. Consider the quiet endurance of these women. They were experts at navigating instability. They adjusted to exile, to diminished wealth, to social invisibility. They learned patience, subtlety, and resilience, skills often undervalued but profoundly important. Their lives demonstrate that power isn't only in public recognition. It can also exist in quiet agency, careful adaptation, and survival under constrained circumstances. There's also a lesson about memory and history. Royal mistresses were often remembered as scandal, intrigue, or moral lesson. Rarely were they remembered as full human beings navigating extremely difficult circumstances with whatever agency they could muster. Their real stories, the quiet complexities, often existed only in surviving letters, estate records, or fleeting mentions by historians.
All right, take another deep breath. Let's drift even further back from the palaces and courts into the quiet spaces where memory itself lingers. By this stage, most former royal mistresses are long gone. Kings and queens are dust, courts are rearranged or disappeared, estates are sold, jewels are melted or resold, and what remains is paper Archives, faded portraits, footnotes, small fragments that suggest a life once lived but cannot convey the texture of it. These women, once central to the intimate decisions of monarchs, now exist mostly in fragments: letters to friends, reports by courtiers, financial records, portraits painted to preserve beauty, flattery, or memory. Each artifact tells only part of the story. And this is the strange tension of history. The louder your life once was, the quieter it sometimes becomes in memory. The corridors that echoed with whispered favors, polite laughter, and strategic conversation now exist only in old floor plans, fading paint, and the occasional gossip recorded in archives. Some historians attempt to piece together these lives. Some succeed partially. Others are left guessing. A signature on a ledger, a note in a diary, a single line in a biography. And yet, even these faint traces allow us to understand patterns of survival, influence, and fragility. There is melancholy here. The people who once mattered most to kings and courts are almost invisible to us. And yet, that invisibility contains a lesson. Not every influence is public. Not every life needs recognition to matter. Some impact is soft, quiet, and slow-moving. Some influence ripples through society in ways that only become visible generations later. And so, as you drift further into thought, imagine these archives like dusty corridors themselves. Each paper, each painting, each ledger is a faint echo of a life once entangled with power. And though the women are gone, those echoes persist, not loud, not immediate, but persistent, in the gentle way that history sometimes whispers. All right, this is the final soft landing. Let's let the story settle completely. No grand finales, just reflection. By now, we can look back and consider what royal mistresses teach us, not about scandal, not about drama, but about life itself. Lesson 1. The fragility of privilege. Proximity to power is temporary. Favor is conditional. Influence can evaporate overnight. These women remind us that no matter how comfortable or secure we feel, circumstances can change unexpectedly. Lesson 2. Resilience is quiet. Surviving dismissal, exile, or public scrutiny requires subtlety, patience, and adaptability. These women lived with uncertainty every day and learned to navigate it as much grace as possible. That quiet persistence is a form of strength often overlooked. Lesson 3. Memory is selective. History remembers kings, queens, and wars. Mistresses are often reduced to stereotypes, but even erased or forgotten, their existence leaves traces: cultural influence, family connections, charitable works, or subtle social changes. Impact does not require fame. Finally, there is the lesson of acceptance and calm reflection. Most mistresses ended life quietly, adapting to changing circumstances and finding small ways to exist with dignity. They teach us that endings need not be dramatic to be meaningful. Survival, reflection, and the soft endurance of daily life can be powerful in their own quiet way. So, as we let this long story drift away, imagine the final moments: gardens fading into twilight, letters resting on old desks, corridors emptied of footsteps, portraits gathering dust. The women are gone, the palaces silent, the influence faded, and yet the echoes remain, gentle, soft, and persistent. Sleep now. Let history's whisper lull you into rest as we leave these lives to their quiet eternity. All right, settle in. The story is softening now. We're no longer in bustling courts or palaces. Instead, we are in the quiet spaces of reflection and memory. By this point, most former royal mistresses have survived every upheaval. Kings have died, queens have stabilized courts, revolutions have passed, and their public influence is gone. What remains is solitude. And yet, this solitude is instructive. It teaches us that influence is not always accompanied by companionship or recognition. These women often lived long after their immediate social circles had vanished. Friends, allies, rivals, children, they were scattered, absorbed into other lives, or gone entirely. In this quiet, the women's daily routines became profoundly important. Reading letters that once held information about court politics, walking gardens that once displayed wealth and power, observing small rituals of family or religion, these simple acts filled the spaces once occupied by grandeur. Loneliness, historically, is rarely dramatic. It is persistent, slow, quiet, and these women experienced it deeply. Yet, in that loneliness, they often found clarity. Free from constant judgment, they could reflect, adapt, and exist with a kind of dignity that courts rarely allowed. It is a strange paradox. The same individuals who were most connected to power, most visible in society, and most envied, often ended life with few companions, quiet days, and only the faint echoes of their past. And perhaps that quiet was the final gentle lesson, that life's significance is not always measured by attention, recognition, or applause, but by persistence, adaptability, and quiet endurance. Finally, we drift into the last part, not a climax, not a resolution, but the final observation. History, after all, does not always reward loudness or drama. It rewards endurance, subtlety, and sometimes complete invisibility. Time is the ultimate arbiter. For royal mistresses, it was both a thief and a healer. It took away wealth, status, and influence, but it also removed immediate scrutiny and public judgment. It allowed some to reflect, adapt, and find peace in ways impossible during the height of court life. Even their legacies, quiet as they were, persisted in unexpected ways. Gardens they designed, libraries they supported, letters they wrote, cultural habits they influenced, these all rippled forward, affecting people who may never have known their names. In this sense, invisibility does not mean insignificance. Their influence endured in subtle, almost imperceptible forms. And finally, as we leave these lives completely, there is a profound softness in realizing that history is not only about kings and queens. It is also about those who lived on the edges, those who observed, influenced, adapted, and endured, often without recognition. These women remind us that human life is complex, subtle, and resilient. So, close your eyes. Let the corridors of palaces, the soft gardens, the quiet rooms, and the gentle echoes of forgotten lives float past your mind. Let the soft lessons of history carry you slowly into reflection, understanding, and rest. Sleep now with the knowledge that even in quiet disappearance, life leaves traces, soft, persistent, and quietly enduring. All right, let's drift gently, slower now, into the lasting echoes of these lives. Even when forgotten publicly, former royal mistresses left subtle imprints on the world around them. Their influence persisted quietly, in culture, in households, in the social norms of the time. Consider the small ways this happens. A library funded with a modest inheritance, a garden designed for contemplation rather than spectacle, a child educated with care who later influences others. None of these acts demanded attention, yet they subtly shaped generations. History rarely records such quiet contributions. It prefers events that are loud, dramatic, or easily summarized. Battles, coronations, marriages, scandals. But human influence is not always so obvious. These women's lives demonstrate that impact can be soft, persistent, and almost invisible, yet enduring. In their later years, many former mistresses moved through society with minimal attention. They walked streets, tended estates, read books, wrote letters, observed changing fashions, and watched the world shift without them. And in doing so, they often found a strange form of freedom, influence without the burden of spectacle, agency without constant scrutiny. There is a lesson here about life itself. Sometimes the quietest actions leave the deepest traces. Sometimes survival, patience, and reflection matter more than public acclaim. These women teach us that value is not always loud, and significance is not always recognized. Finally, the very last part. Let's allow this story to settle completely. By now, every former royal mistress we've been following has receded into the soft shadows of history. Palaces are silent, children have grown, records are tucked away, the world has moved on, and their lives, once central to intrigue and power, now exist primarily as whispers. And yet, even in this quiet, there is dignity. These women survived systems stacked against them. They adapted to exile, obscurity, and fading relevance. They learned patience, subtlety, and quiet resilience. They lived and endured even when recognition vanished. As we reflect, the lesson is gentle but clear. Life's value is not always measured by attention, power, or fame. Influence can be subtle. Legacy can be quiet. Survival can be remarkable in its own understated way. Picture for a final moment these women in their last years, walking gardens at dusk, reading by candlelight, observing grandchildren, tending small estates, savoring quiet moments. The corridors of power are empty. The public eye has moved on, but these lives, soft and unheralded, continue in small ways through history's fabric. Let this long, gentle journey end softly. Let the stories of these women, once at the edges of power, linger quietly in your mind as you drift toward rest. Their lives were fleeting and fragile, yet persistent in subtle, unforgettable ways. Sleep now, letting the quiet of history carry you gently into the night.
All right, let's settle in and drift slowly into the quieter world of former royal mistresses. By this point in their lives, most of the women we've been following have long left the corridors of grand palaces, the echoing footsteps of servants, the whispered gossip of courtiers, and the intense scrutiny of queens. The glittering robes, jeweled apartments, and the constant parade of favors have vanished. In their place are small estates, modest houses, or quiet cottages, where time seems to move differently, slower, softer, less urgent. These spaces are not dramatic. There are no banners, no audiences, no constant performance of relevance. Just walls, rooms, gardens, and the gentle rhythm of daily life. Morning light creeps through windows, catching dust motes in soft streams. Candles are lit in the evening, shadows lengthened across familiar furniture, and footsteps echo quietly across floors that once were polished for appearances rather than comfort. Life here is smaller. Daily routines take center stage, walking in gardens, tending plants, feeding animals, overseeing household staff, reading letters, reflecting on past events. Each task is ordinary, but it is suffused with a kind of dignity. These women have learned, slowly and often painfully, that survival in obscurity requires patience, observation, and subtle control over the spaces they can influence. Even without crowns or formal power, influence persists, just in different forms.
The children they once protected, taught, or nurtured now move through the world as adults, carrying lessons from their early lives. Neighbors and household staff absorb habits, decorum, and wisdom, even without realizing it. Small gestures, a word of advice, a carefully tended garden, a decision about estate management ripple outward quietly, leaving marks that may only be noticed decades later. There is also time for reflection here. Letters are written slowly, deliberately. Some are sent, most remain private. Reflections on the past, on decisions made under pressure, on children placed in distant care, on favors won and lost, on friendships, rivalries, and betrayals fill these pages. And often there is melancholy woven through, a recognition of how transient fortune truly is and how fragile human attachment can be when it depends on power, wealth, and favor. Yet within that melancholy there is also calm, a sense of control over what remains. In the quiet of estates, a woman can dictate her schedule, manage her surroundings, and make choices that matter in small but meaningful ways. There is autonomy here, though it is different from the public influence she once had. It is slower, softer, deliberate. Gardens, in particular, take on symbolic weight. Walking along paths that she has planted or maintained, observing the slow rhythm of seasons, watching flowers bloom and fade, these moments become metaphors for the cycles of life. Power rises and falls. Favors are granted and revoked. Children grow, marry, and leave. And yet there is constancy in the soil, in tending life deliberately, day after day. The garden becomes a space for quiet reflection, a place to exert agency gently and meaningfully. Even social interaction is slow. Former allies may visit infrequently. Distant family may write occasionally. The women learn to navigate relationships carefully, investing attention where it matters and letting go where it does not. Subtle diplomacy continues, but in a quieter, less visible arena. Influence is exercised through conversation, guidance, and observation, rather than spectacle and public notice. And there is still history moving quietly around them. Events beyond their control, new monarchs, political reforms, local upheavals, or changes in culture shape the backdrop of their lives. Yet, unlike the chaos of court life, they now occupy positions where they can observe and adapt without the same pressure to perform. Survival has become a quiet practice, a slow mastery of adaptation. In the evenings, they read, write, and reflect. Candles burn low, letters are penned, often unsigned or saved for personal reflection rather than public record. They recall moments of favor, scandal, and intrigue, weighing them not for notoriety, but for understanding. And in that reflection, there is a gentle wisdom, a comprehension of human nature, of the fragility of fortune, and the subtle persistence of life beyond the glare of attention. And there is also a rhythm to time that court life never allowed. Days are measured by light, by meals, by tasks small and ordinary. Years pass with a gentle weight, each one teaching the patience that power never could. Aging, which might have seemed a liability in courts obsessed with youth and novelty, now becomes a companion. The changes of the body, the soft decay of objects, the inevitable fading of influence, these are observed without panic, with a calm acceptance, and sometimes with a quiet pride in having endured. And so, life in these estates, simple as it may appear, is layered with experience. Former mistresses have learned that influence is not always public, that control is not always dramatic, and that legacy can persist quietly through acts small, subtle, and deliberate. The rooms may be modest, the gardens may be private, the letters may never be read, and yet their existence, their persistence, and their adaptability leave traces, faint but real, across time. Even in fading there is significance. Even in obscurity life continues. And so we can imagine them, walking slowly through gardens, reading by candlelight, reflecting on decades of human interaction, watching children grow, offering advice where it matters, and letting the world drift by without constant interference. Their days are soft, repetitive, and quietly dignified. They have survived history's loudness and now exist in the calm spaces where survival itself becomes the measure of success. And in this quiet persistence, there is a lesson for us all, that life, influence, and legacy do not always need to be loud or dramatic to matter, that endurance, subtlety, and the small acts of care and reflection can be quietly transformative, that history may forget names, but it does not entirely erase the lives of those who adapt, persist, and endure. So drift along with them, softly, gently, through estates, gardens, letters, and reflections. Let this slow rhythm settle into your mind as we leave Part 17 to linger quietly in history's softer corridors.
All right, settle back, dim the lights, and let's drift slowly into another layer of the quiet world of former royal mistresses. By now, the women we're following have fully left the public stage. Palaces are behind them, courts are distant echoes, and the world of intrigue has softened into memory. One of the main companions in these years is time itself. It stretches gently, like the slow unfolding of a candle flame, marking days without urgency, guiding reflections without demand. And with time comes letters. Letters written with care, deliberate ink on carefully folded paper. Some are sent to distant relatives, old friends, or children who have moved into their own worlds. Most remain private, tucked away in drawers or chests, addressed only to memory and reflection. These letters are fascinating because they reveal the internal life of women once seen only in terms of public scandal or royal favor. They contain reflections on past choices, how to navigate the whims of a king, how to secure a child's future, how to survive sudden exile or loss of favor. They are sometimes defensive, sometimes tender, sometimes melancholy, and almost always they reveal the wisdom hard-won through decades of living at the edges of power and observing human nature in its most intense forms. And time also becomes central. In quiet afternoons, they recall events that once dominated the headlines of court life: parties, scandals, rivalries, favors granted or lost. And in recalling, there is both comfort and melancholy. Comfort because they survived, outlived, and adapted. Melancholy because they see how fleeting fortune truly was, how much depended on the whims of others, and how quickly influence can fade. Some letters and memoirs are practical, advice to children, guidance to household staff, recommendations to friends. Others are personal, almost meditative, pondering the passage of time and the nature of human relationships. These writings serve as a soft way of asserting continuity, a way of leaving a mark without demanding recognition. Even in this quiet, influence persists, though invisibly. Advice given in letters can ripple outward through generations. A child guided carefully may later influence others, spreading subtle lessons learned from a life of observation. Household staff may adopt habits or decorum observed in the mistress's careful management. Artists or local craftspeople, supported quietly, may produce works that carry her influence for decades. Small acts unnoticed by the public, but enduring in subtle ways. Daily life continues to provide structure. Gardens are tended, letters are written, rooms are organized, and small decisions about estates or finances demand attention. Every day carries rhythm, but also reflection. Each task, no matter how mundane, has meaning because it is deliberate, because it is chosen, because it is done quietly, without public scrutiny. Even reading becomes a companion. Books are selected slowly, read carefully, often revisited. Sometimes literature or philosophy, sometimes religious or moral instruction. Reading allows them to place their lives in broader perspective, to see patterns of human behavior, to contextualize their own experiences with power, influence, and survival.
And there is a subtle meditation here on aging. As hair grays and movement slows, the urgency of youth and courtly spectacle fades entirely. What remains is understanding, patience, and calm observation. Decisions are made deliberately, without haste. Influence is exercised softly, without the need for recognition. Legacy is measured not by fame, but by endurance, adaptation, and the small, persistent ripples left in everyday life. Even relationships are redefined in these years. Old friends, once allies in court intrigue, may visit infrequently. Children may have their own families. Rivals may have faded from memory entirely. And yet this distance allows former mistresses to cultivate relationships with subtlety, choosing where to invest attention, and understanding that influence does not always need an audience to matter. There is also quiet contemplation of mortality. Letters and reflections often touch on the inevitable passage of life, the knowledge that influence, beauty, and favor are temporary, and that survival itself, calm, deliberate, dignified, is a remarkable achievement. And in these reflections there is a gentle wisdom learned over decades of living at the margins of power and observing human nature in its most intense forms. And finally, there is beauty in small things. The scent of flowers in a carefully tended garden, the flicker of candlelight on a page, the quiet laughter of a grandchild, the gentle routine of domestic life. These soft moments, unnoticed by history, carry profound significance. They offer peace, reflection, and subtle fulfillment even in the absence of public recognition. So, as we drift with Part 18, imagine these women in their small estates, surrounded by gardens, letters, and memories. Each day flows slowly, deliberately, softly. Influence continues quietly. Reflection persists gently. Life in all its subtlety endures. And as the candle burns low and the garden grows quiet, we can appreciate the gentle persistence of these lives, unseen by the public, often ignored by history, but enduring in the softest, most human ways.
All right, settle in and let your mind drift slowly. By now, most former royal mistresses have completely left the public stage. The palaces are silent, courtiers are gone, children have grown, letters have been written, read, and tucked away. And yet, even in this quiet, influence persists. Influence is no longer exercised through grand gestures or courtly intrigues. It is subtle, almost imperceptible. Advice to children becomes guidance that shapes future decisions. Wisdom offered to household staff subtly alters the rhythm of daily life. Charity quietly distributed influences communities. Even small artistic commissions, paintings, music, or literature ripple through time far beyond the original scope. These women exist in the margins, and yet those margins are meaningful. Influence does not need recognition to endure. They have learned to shape the world softly, deliberately, and invisibly, leaving traces that historians often overlook, but which quietly shape the lives of those around them. Daily routines are steady, almost meditative. Walking in gardens, tending to animals, reading by candlelight, maintaining estates. Each action is deliberate, chosen, and grounded. The rhythm of small decisions, repeated day after day, gives structure and meaning to life in obscurity. The past may have been loud, filled with favors, scandals, and intrigue, but the present is deliberate, calm, and reflective. Reflection itself becomes an act of subtle power. They observe the world as it moves on without them. Monarchs rise and fall, societies shift, revolutions occur, and yet their small, quiet actions
guiding a grandchild, supporting a neighbor, maintaining a library or garden persist. The public may forget them, but life remembers in small, enduring ways. There is also a meditation on the fragility and impermanence of favor. They remember past glories, the attention of kings, the envy of queens, the gossip of courtiers, and yet they no longer chase recognition. They have learned that survival, subtle influence, and quiet reflection are more lasting than applause or notoriety. Even relationships evolve into softer forms. Old friends visit less frequently, children live distant lives, rivals fade from memory. And yet these women cultivate bonds deliberately, understanding that influence can be gentle and enduring, even without an audience. They have mastered the art of patience, subtlety, and persistence. Gardens, again, play a symbolic role. Observing the slow rhythm of seasons, planting, pruning, and tending, they see parallels to life itself. Power rises and falls, fortune waxes and wanes, relationships change. Yet careful cultivation of plants, habits, or relationships creates enduring beauty. The quiet labor of daily care becomes its own form of lasting impact. Reading and writing continue to sustain them. Letters, memoirs, notes to descendants, and reflections on the past form a gentle archive of lived experience. These records may never be read widely, may never make it into grand histories, but they preserve human insight, wisdom, and the quiet endurance of a life once lived at the edges of power. And there is comfort in these small, invisible legacies. They remind us that life does not need public recognition to be meaningful. Influence does not need applause. Survival, reflection, and adaptation, soft, deliberate, and persistent, carry their own quiet dignity. As we drift through Part 19, imagine these women walking slowly along garden paths at dusk, observing flowers and birds, reading letters by candlelight, reflecting on decades of experiences with kings, queens, and courts. Imagine them quietly shaping lives through soft guidance, small decisions, and subtle acts of care. Life moves gently, influence persists invisibly, and memory lingers quietly in every deliberate gesture. And in that calm persistence, there is a profound lesson. Life does not need to be loud to be enduring. Influence does not need spectacle to matter. Survival itself, quietly, patiently, and thoughtfully, can leave traces that ripple forward long after history forgets the names behind them.
All right, let's drift gently, slower now, into the lasting echoes of these lives. Even when forgotten publicly, former royal mistresses left subtle imprints on the world around them. Their influence persisted quietly, in culture, in households, in the social norms of the time. Consider the small ways this happens. A library funded with a modest inheritance, a garden designed for contemplation rather than spectacle, a child educated with care who later influences others. None of these acts demanded attention, yet they subtly shaped generations. History rarely records such quiet contributions. It prefers events that are loud, dramatic, or easily summarized. Battles, coronations, marriages, scandals. But human influence is not always so obvious. These women's lives demonstrate that impact can be soft, persistent, and almost invisible, yet enduring. In their later years, many former mistresses moved through society with minimal attention. They walked streets, tended estates, read books, wrote letters, observed changing fashions, and watched the world shift without them. And in doing so, they often found a strange form of freedom, influence without the burden of spectacle, agency without constant scrutiny. There is a lesson here about life itself. Sometimes the quietest actions leave the deepest traces. Sometimes survival, patience, and reflection matter more than public acclaim. These women teach us that value is not always loud and significance is not always recognized. Finally, the very last part. Let's allow this story to settle completely. By now, every former royal mistress we've been following has receded into the soft shadows of history. Palaces are silent, children have grown, records are tucked away, the world has moved on, and their lives, once central to intrigue and power, now exist primarily as whispers. And yet, even in this quiet, there is dignity. These women survived systems stacked against them. They adapted to exile, obscurity, and fading relevance. They learned patience, subtlety, and quiet resilience. They lived and endured even when recognition vanished. As we reflect, the lesson is gentle but clear. Life's value is not always measured by attention, power, or fame. Influence can be subtle. Legacy can be quiet. Survival can be remarkable in its own understated way. Picture for a final moment these women in their last years, walking gardens at dusk, reading by candlelight, observing grandchildren, tending small estates, savoring quiet moments. The corridors of power are empty. The public eye has moved on, but these lives, soft and unheralded, continue in small ways through history's fabric. Let this long, gentle journey end softly. Let the stories of these women, once at the edges of power, linger quietly in your mind as you drift toward rest. Their lives were fleeting and fragile, yet persistent in subtle, unforgettable ways. Sleep now, letting the quiet of history carry you gently into the night.
All right, settle in. Dim the lights, relax, and let this final drift of thought carry you. By now, the lives of these former royal mistresses have receded from the immediate timelines of courts and history books. Kings and queens are long gone, and even the children who once relied on their guidance have created lives of their own. Yet in this fading, there is something quietly remarkable. Influence persists, even when memory does not. Think of influence not as a flashy crown or public proclamation, but as something invisible, subtle, and enduring. A child shaped by a soft word of guidance may carry that lesson into adulthood, subtly influencing their own children. Advice given to a neighbor or household member can ripple quietly through communities. Gardens, libraries, and small estates, once symbols of personal favor or wealth, continue to exist long after their patrons have passed. Time, as always, is the companion here. It blurs events, softens memories, and removes immediate pressures. Yet in its quiet way, it also preserves fragments. Letters tucked in drawers, diaries never published, and estates maintained by careful hands all leave traces that ripple forward into the future. There is a meditation here on human persistence. These women survived chaos, courtly intrigue, personal loss, exile, and fading public attention. They endured circumstances beyond their control and adapted to quieter, simpler rhythms. That endurance, soft and patient, becomes a form of legacy in itself, one invisible to history, yet real. Reflection occupies much of their days. They recall times of power, notice the impermanence of favor, and observe the slow unfolding of the world beyond their influence. Sometimes there is melancholy, sometimes a gentle satisfaction. They recognize that life is a series of fleeting moments, but that even small actions, a carefully tended garden, a kind word, a letter, can persist far longer than any crown or title. Even absence becomes a form of presence. Being forgotten publicly does not erase impact. The subtle shaping of family, culture, and memory persists like a whisper across time. These echoes are soft, often unnoticed, yet they are persistent. Daily routines remain grounding.
walking gardens, tending rooms, observing seasons, reading and writing. Each action is deliberate, chosen, and meaningful. These small rhythms give shape and dignity to lives otherwise erased from public memory. Life continues, quietly, deliberately, softly. And so, as Part 21 drifts toward its end, imagine these women in the calm of late afternoons. Sunlight on fading walls, soft shadows across paths, letters carefully read, gardens watched with patient eyes, children or grandchildren observed from a distance. Their presence is quiet, their influence is subtle, and their lives, though erased from public drama, continue to ripple quietly in ways that matter. History may forget names. Courtiers, kings, and queens may overshadow them in records, but the persistence of human life, the ability to adapt, endure, and quietly shape the world remains. These women, once at the edges of power, remind us that influence is not always loud, and significance does not always demand attention. And in that realization, we find a calm, soft lesson. Life matters even in quiet, subtle forms. Endurance, reflection, and patient care are legacies as real as any crown. Sleep now. Let the gentle echoes of these lives drift with you, soft and unhurried, through the corridors of history and imagination. All right, settle back, dim the lights, and let your mind float gently. We've been following the quiet lives of former royal mistresses for a long time now, through favor, scandal, exile, and fading public influence. By Part 21, most of these women have fully receded from the courts, the palaces, the whispers of gossip, and even the memory of most historians. And yet, their stories persist in subtle, invisible ways. Life at this stage is soft, deliberate, and layered with reflection. Their days are measured not in audience or approval, but in small, intentional acts. Walking through gardens they once planted or maintained, they notice the slow rhythm of seasons, flowers blooming and fading, birds appearing and disappearing, shadows shifting with the sun. These moments, as ordinary as they may seem, provide rhythm, continuity, and a sense of control in a world that once felt unpredictable and precarious. Letters remain companions. Some are sent, carefully addressed to children, distant relatives, or old friends. Many remain private, tucked into drawers, chests, or boxes. In writing, they process decades of experiences, navigating favor, surviving exile, losing and gaining influence, protecting children, and negotiating social spaces that never fully welcomed them. These writings are meditative, sometimes melancholy, sometimes tender, always thoughtful. They allow the women to make sense of a life once defined by public perception and external pressure. Memory is another quiet companion. In soft afternoons, they reflect on past events, courtly intrigues, royal whims, scandal, rivalries, alliances, and fleeting favors. The past is vivid, yet distant. In recalling, there is both satisfaction and melancholy. Satisfaction because they endured, outlived, and adapted. Melancholy because they recognize the fleeting nature of power, influence, and human attachment. Even as public influence fades, invisible influence persists. Guidance given to children, grandchildren, household staff, or local neighbors shapes behavior, decisions, and even culture. Small acts, teaching a child patience, mentoring a young woman, supporting a local artist, planting a tree, ripple quietly through time. They leave subtle legacies that no historian may record, but which persist nonetheless. Daily routines anchor these lives. Walking slowly through estates, tending gardens, feeding animals, reading by candlelight, overseeing the household, or writing letters. Each action is deliberate, meaningful, and measured. The rhythm of these tasks replace the chaos of court life with calm, predictable structure. Influence is no longer flashy. It is soft, deliberate, and quietly powerful. There is also a profound meditation on the fragility of public favor. They remember the attention of kings, the envy of queens, the whispers of courtiers, and the fleeting nature of beauty, status, and recognition. And yet, they have learned that survival, subtle influence, and calm reflection endure far longer than applause or notoriety. Even relationships evolve. Old friends visit infrequently. Children may have their own families. Rivals fade from memory. And yet, these women cultivate bonds deliberately, understanding that influence can be soft and enduring even without attention. They have mastered patience, observation, and subtle guidance, exercising quiet power in spaces that history often overlooks. Gardens again offer symbolic meaning. Observing seasons, pruning flowers, tending paths, and nurturing life, they see parallels to their own experiences. Power rises and falls, fortune waxes and wanes, relationships shift, yet careful cultivation creates enduring beauty. The small acts of care, repetition, and observation become their quiet legacy. Reading and writing sustain them. Books, letters, and private reflections form a soft archive of knowledge and insight. These records may never be widely read, may never enter history books, but they preserve human experience, wisdom, and quiet endurance. Each page is a conversation with memory, a meditation on time, and a gentle assertion of presence in a world that largely forgets them. And here there is comfort in fading. Public scrutiny is gone, courtly pressures vanish, influence exists in subtle, invisible ways. Life is deliberate, reflective, and calm. Survival itself, patient and measured, becomes a remarkable achievement. So imagine for a final moment in part 21, these women walking slowly through gardens at dusk, letters in hand, observing grandchildren or young relatives, reading by candlelight, reflecting on decades of experience. Their presence is quiet, their influence is subtle, and their lives, though largely erased from public drama, continue to ripple quietly, gently, persistently. History may forget names, courts may erase events, and memory may fade, but endurance, subtlety, reflection, and quiet guidance leave traces that matter. And in these traces, we find the human lesson. Life does not need to be loud to endure, and influence does not need attention to persist. Sleep now. Let the soft echoes of these lives drift with you, soft and unhurried, through the corridors of history and imagination.
All right, settle back, dim the lights, and let this gentle story float through your mind. By now, the women we followed have fully receded from the public eye. Palaces are silent, courtiers are gone, kings, queens, and children have moved on. And yet, life continues, slowly, softly, quietly. Even without attention, influence persists. It exists in small acts: advice to grandchildren, guidance to neighbors, careful management of estates, or support for local artists and scholars. These acts are invisible to most, unnoticed by history, yet they ripple forward, shaping lives in subtle, persistent ways. Power no longer requires spectacle. It exists in the quiet execution of deliberate choices. Daily life has become rhythmic. Walking through gardens, observing the slow progression of seasons, tending plants, reading letters, and writing reflections, all of these fill the days with gentle purpose. The past, once loud and dramatic, has softened into memory, reflection, and occasional melancholy. Each moment of attention is deliberate, a quiet assertion of presence in a world that largely forgets them. Memory is both companion and teacher. They recall moments of favor, betrayal, love, and loss. They observe how power rises and falls, how relationships change, how fortune waxes and wanes. And in this observation, there is calm understanding, the impermanence of status, the fragility of public attention, and the endurance of thoughtful action. Letters remain central. Some are sent, carefully addressed to distant family or old friends. Many remain private, tucked into drawers or boxes. These writings preserve reflections, guidance, and observations. They are acts of quiet legacy, enduring beyond public memory, and forming a personal archive of human experience. Relationships evolve with care. Old friends may visit sporadically, children pursue their own lives, rivals fade from consciousness. And yet bonds are cultivated deliberately, attention is given selectively, and influence continues quietly. In this subtle social sphere, patience, observation, and soft guidance replace courtly intrigue and public drama. Gardens, once symbols of wealth and display, now reflect life's subtle rhythms. Observing the slow unfolding of flowers, pruning paths, tending the soil, and noticing the interplay of light and shadow becomes meditation. These acts are quiet but enduring, mirroring the persistence of life itself. Care, repetition, and observation leave traces in the world even when memory forgets names. Reading and reflection become companions. Books are revisited, letters are reread, and thoughts are quietly considered. These small practices preserve insight, experience, and understanding, even without public recognition. Wisdom now exists in subtle, private forms, and quiet endurance is valued over spectacle. And finally, there is peace in fading. Public scrutiny no longer matters. Courtly pressures have vanished. Influence continues invisibly, quietly, softly. Life slows. Reflection deepens. Survival itself, deliberate and patient, becomes the greatest achievement. Imagine for a final moment in part 22, these women walking through gardens at sunset, observing grandchildren, reading by candlelight, reflecting on decades of life. Their footsteps are soft. Their influence is subtle. Their presence, though largely forgotten by history, continues to ripple quietly, persistently, gently. Even as the world moves on, they remind us that life matters not only in grand gestures, but in patience, subtlety, quiet care, and deliberate reflection. Endurance, soft influence, and calm observation leave traces that history may not record, but which persist quietly, gently, and meaningfully. Sleep now. Let these echoes, soft and unhurried, carry you into calm, reflective rest, soft, unhurried, and quietly enduring. All right, settle back, relax, and let your mind drift slowly. By now, the women we've been following live fully in quiet spaces, small estates, cottages, gardens, and rooms softened by time. The grandeur of palaces, the gossip of courts, and the scrutiny of queens are long gone. Life moves slowly, deliberately, softly, and in this slow movement there is meaning. Daily life is rhythmic and deliberate. They walk in gardens, noticing the slow unfolding of flowers and the gentle shift of seasons. They tend rooms and household spaces, feed animals, oversee small estates, and observe grandchildren or younger relatives from a distance. Every action is measured, intentional, and quietly significant. Influence is exercised gently, without spectacle, and leaves subtle marks in the lives of those around them. Letters and writings continue to occupy time. Some are sent to family or friends, carrying advice, care, or reflections. Most remain private, preserved as personal archives of experience and memory. These writings reflect on decades of living at the margins of power, lessons about patience, survival, human behavior, and the impermanence of favor. They are gentle, meditative, and sometimes tinged with nostalgia or melancholy. Memory itself becomes a companion. They recall moments of power, rivalry, affection, and disappointment. The rise and fall of kings and queens, the fleeting attention of courtiers, the ephemeral nature of beauty and influence, all are observed with quiet understanding. There is satisfaction in survival, even without recognition, and wisdom in observing the impermanence of public favor. Even social influence continues in subtle ways. Advice to children, guidance to staff, support for neighbors, and small charitable acts ripple quietly into the world. These acts, largely invisible to history, leave enduring traces. They remind us that influence does not need public acknowledgement to be real. It exists in patience, care, and quiet action. Gardens, again, provide a soft meditation on life. Tending flowers, observing light and shadow, walking familiar paths, they mirror human experience, growth, decay, repetition, and beauty in small details. Through these routines, the women maintain continuity and connection to life, even as the wider world has moved on. Reading and reflection anchor their days. Books, letters, and private musings preserve insight, experience, and understanding. Through slow contemplation, they integrate decades of experience and human observation into calm wisdom. They learn that quiet endurance, reflection, and deliberate action are lasting forms of power. And finally, there is peace in fading. The public gaze is gone. Courtly expectations have vanished. Influence continues softly, invisibly, and patiently. Life slows, reflection deepens, and survival itself becomes a remarkable achievement. Imagine for a final moment in Part 23, these women walking slowly through gardens at dusk, reading letters by candlelight, observing grandchildren, reflecting on decades of life. Their presence is soft, their influence is subtle, their legacy quiet yet persistent. History may not record their names, palaces may crumble, courts may forget, but the quiet endurance, subtle influence, and patient reflection of these lives continue, softly shaping the world in invisible ways. Sleep now. Let these gentle currents of these lives carry you into calm, reflective rest, soft, unhurried, and quietly enduring.
All right, settle in, dim the lights, and let your mind float gently. By this stage, most former royal mistresses live in spaces removed from the chaos of court life. Small estates, quiet cottages, overgrown gardens, and sunlit rooms have replaced palaces, audiences, and whispered gossip. Time moves slowly here, measured by the growth of plants, the movement of shadows, and the rhythm of daily routines. Life is deliberate and layered. Walking through gardens, they notice subtle changes, flowers blooming, leaves turning, birds appearing and vanishing. They prune, plant, and maintain with quiet attention, observing life's small patterns. These simple acts carry a kind of persistent influence, shaping the environment, guiding staff, and offering lessons to children or grandchildren who may visit occasionally. Letters and reflections remain constant companions. Some are sent to friends or distant relatives. Many remain private, tucked in drawers, written for memory rather than recognition. In them, they reflect on years of favor, exile, public scrutiny, lost attention, and enduring resilience. Each word carries soft wisdom learned through decades of navigating a world that valued beauty and status above all else. Memory provides both comfort and contemplation. They recall moments of influence, scandal, affection, and betrayal. They observe how fleeting favor truly is, how quickly power shifts, and how human attachment is often conditional. Yet in the soft quiet of their days, they find satisfaction in having endured, survived, and quietly shaped lives without spectacle. Influence persists in subtle ways. Advice offered to grandchildren, guidance given to staff,
support for neighbors, and charitable acts ripple quietly through the world. These gestures, invisible to most historians, are real and lasting. They remind us that quiet, deliberate influence often outlives public drama. Gardens are symbolic, reflective spaces. The slow progression of seasons mirrors human life, growth, decay, change, and quiet beauty. Through daily care, observation, and gentle repetition, the women assert agency over small corners of the world, shaping their environment and leaving enduring traces of presence and patience. Reading and reflection anchor their days. Books, letters, and private musings preserve insight and understanding. They contemplate human behavior, impermanence, and survival. Through reflection, they learn that endurance, patience, and subtle influence are as powerful as any crown or public favor once held. And finally, there is a profound peace in fading. Public attention no longer matters. Courtly pressures have vanished. Life continues in quiet reflection, deliberate care, and patient observation. Survival itself, measured in calm persistence, becomes a remarkable achievement. Imagine, for a final moment in Part 24, these women walking slowly through gardens at sunset, observing shadows and sunlight, reading letters, reflecting on decades of life, and quietly tending to the world they can still influence. Their presence is gentle, their influence subtle, and their legacy invisible to most, yet quietly enduring. History may forget names, palaces may crumble, courts may vanish, but the quiet persistence, subtle guidance, and patient reflection of these lives continue softly, shaping the world in ways only time can measure. Sleep now. Let these gentle echoes, soft and unhurried, carry you into calm, reflective rest, alongside the enduring, invisible lives of those who lived quietly at the edges of power. All right, settle in, dim the lights, and let your mind drift slowly. By this point, the women we've been following have fully receded into quiet, private lives. The bustling palaces, the whispers of courtiers, and the scrutiny of queens are long gone. Life now moves in measured, deliberate rhythms, soft, persistent, and deeply reflective. Daily routines shape the flow of their existence. Walking gardens, tending plants, observing the slow movement of seasons, feeding animals, or managing small estates, their days are filled with deliberate acts that carry significance, even if not noticed by the wider world. Influence now exists in small, invisible ways, guiding grandchildren, offering advice to neighbors, shaping household habits, or supporting local artists. These acts ripple quietly through time, unseen but enduring. Letters and private writings continue to occupy much of their days. Some are sent to distant relatives or old friends, but most remain tucked away, unread by others. In these pages, they process decades of experience, surviving favor and exile, navigating public scrutiny, protecting children, and adapting to life beyond courtly intrigue. The writings are reflective, meditative, and sometimes tinged with gentle melancholy, offering insight into lives once defined by power, beauty, and attention. Memory becomes a companion as well. They recall moments of influence, love, rivalry, betrayal, and fleeting public favor. The rise and fall of kings, the jealousy of queens, the gossip of courtiers, all are softened by time. In reflection, there is satisfaction in endurance and quiet pride in having navigated a world that often demanded spectacle over substance. Gardens take on symbolic weight. Observing the growth and decay of plants, the interplay of light and shadow, and the slow rhythm of seasons mirrors the passage of human life.
Through careful attention and repetition, the women assert agency over the spaces they can control, leaving subtle, enduring traces of care and presence. Reading and reflection anchor their days. Books, letters, and private musings preserve insight and understanding. They contemplate human behavior, impermanence, and survival. Through reflection, they learn that endurance, patience, and subtle influence are as powerful as any crown or public favor once held. And finally, there is a profound peace in fading. Public attention no longer matters. Courtly pressures have vanished. Life continues in quiet reflection, deliberate care, and patient observation. Survival itself, measured in calm persistence, becomes a remarkable achievement. Imagine, for a final moment in Part 25, these women walking slowly through gardens at sunset, reading letters by candlelight, observing shadows, reflecting on decades of life, and quietly tending to the world they can still influence. Their presence is gentle, their influence subtle, and their legacy invisible to most, yet quietly enduring. Even as history forgets names, palaces may crumble, courts may vanish, but the quiet persistence, subtle guidance, and patient reflection of these lives continue softly, shaping the world in ways only time can measure. Sleep now. Let these gentle echoes, soft and unhurried, carry you into calm, reflective rest, alongside the enduring, invisible lives of those who lived quietly at the edges of power.